Your last talk. There will not be any performance graphs or anything like that. I want to talk instead about code literacy and a new form of literacy, but I want to start by explaining why you might care. So I got the opportunity to work in Kampala, Uganda for several months, and there are a couple of projects that really struck me. And the first was a project by a Western aid organization to bring water into a village, because the women in the village had to walk every day to the remote well and bring water back to the village. And they thought, well, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to empower the women by putting in this water pipe? And so they brought a water pipe to the village. And it kept getting damaged, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. And then they actually talked to the women and found out, actually, that walk to the well, that ability to interact, that was their only social interaction of the day. And so the women were actually the ones sabotaging the water pipe so that they could at least have a chance to talk to someone else, to have some kind of exposure to some other context other than their home. The people who put the water pipe in were completely oblivious of what was going on in that village. They were trying to help, they just didn't know how. There's another situation. I had the opportunity to judge a mobile app competition, and the winner of the feature phone competition had the following very simple idea. The problem she was trying to solve, the water into their village, was highly unreliable. And so every day, one representative from every family stood in front of the water pipe until the water started flowing, and then they would fill up their jugs. And this meant every family had to sacrifice an unknown amount of time at school or working with the field or doing whatever it is that they did in their normal life. One member from every family. So what she decided to do with this feature phone app, and she won the competition, it was basically a phone tree. Everybody had a feature phone. Every day, the app would send out an SMS to one person, one family, and say, you've got the water pipe today. And then when the water started flowing, that person hit the button and it sent a text to all of the other families saying, come now, the water is running. So now, all of those other families, their children got to stay in school longer, they got to work longer, they got to maybe sleep more. And so the quality of life improvement was enormous. And yet think about what we would have done. There would have been a sensor that would have sent out some kind of, but then you would have had to align the sensor and who was going to maintain it and who would monitor it. Completely inappropriate. Very simple idea. I doubt anybody from the West would have thought of it. So the problem is, we don't live in the culture of all of the people who can take advantage of technology. We can't understand what's culturally important because we don't live in that environment. And unless people in those cultures, looking at those problems from their perspective, have a chance to influence technology decisions, we're going to continue to have mistakes like this. And so that's why I share these stories, to start you thinking about how, with the best intentions, we're actually building bad systems. You can also think of this in our own context. Many of the natural language processing systems for help around health issues, they can recognize heart attack. They can't recognize the phrase, I was beaten by my husband. There is a heart monitor that fits about 90% of the men and only 20% of the women because they're smaller. And the company has no interest in building a device that will actually fit a woman. These aren't just being disconnected from other cultures, this is being disconnected from ours. And the reality is there are 3.2 billion people online right now, and none of us can understand what it is those 3.2 billion people need. What we used to think about as the digital divide is largely shrinking. Even in some of the poorest parts of the world, many people have cell phone access, and so they can get access to information that perhaps they couldn't get access to before. What we have instead is an access gap and an influence gap and a knowledge gap of how to actually build technology solutions that solve problems in a way that's appropriate for these different contexts. Now, why do we care about this? 285 new pieces of content every day per user of social media. We're getting bombarded by data. Mobile payments. There are some places where it's actually hard to use cash now, even credit cards, because everything is done through mobile payments. We're proliferating health-related apps. All of these connected devices, some of them talking to our doctors. Some of these applications are enormous benefits. They bring enormous benefits to their users to help them manage things like diabetes, even mental health. There are apps that will help prevent suicides and help with counseling after cancer therapy. So we've got a huge proliferation of apps that are generally bringing improved quality of life to many people. And then we have all of these devices that are changing the way we interact with our television, that are changing the way we shop. Even in a store, there are mirrors that will help you see what this thing looks like. All of our relationships are changing. Probably many of you know someone, if not yourself, who met their current partner through an online dating service. We maintain contact with an extended family that it was much harder to reach before. So we have all of these technology influences, and many people don't know how they work. We have all of these new roles that are starting to come up. The way we work is changing. The jobs that typically you didn't have to know a whole lot about technology are now different as well. So our way of working is very different. And what about all these jobs that you couldn't even conceive of doing if you didn't have an appreciation of technology? How in the world would you be a robotics human interface specialist if you didn't have some understanding of the technology that enabled the robot to interact? Little scarier, this thing might eventually turn into something that's embedded in my skin. We've got more and more devices that are connected to us. We are looking at technology in different ways. We are allowing technology into our world in a way that we never have in the past. And all of you, or most of you, are sitting there thinking, yeah, we know all this. We do. We're in the technology industry. I think to some of the conversations I have with my brother and sister, who are both very well educated, and they're scientists, and they look at me like I'm speaking a foreign language when I try to explain to them that no, algorithms are not objective because they are programmed by a person. Think about Volkswagen. Those Volkswagen algorithms that had 2 different performance characteristics, that wasn't something that just popped into thin air. Those programmers introduced that. That's a very societally neutral example, but it demonstrates there are people who do believe if it is a computer program, it has no bias. It has no agenda. Sorry, we're creating them. We are human beings. We have biases. We have agendas. Those things are getting encoded into these algorithms, and many people don't understand that. This is what I call the code literacy gap. And it's not just code. It's an appreciation of how technology works and what technology can and cannot do, and what, as humans, as citizens, we need to worry about with what technology is doing. Now, it's no surprise, literacy is power. Over the centuries, elites have tried to control access to knowledge. There are many countries today where women, it's forbidden for them to learn how to read. It was considered a crime in the United States during the era of slavery to teach a black man how to read. Years and decades and centuries, people have recognized knowledge is power and literacy is power. And so those of us who have that literacy currently have power that others do not have. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying everybody has to be the world's most fantastic programmer. They're not. I wouldn't make a very good medical doctor. That's what my sister does. I'm not saying my sister has to be a wonderful technologist, but she needs to be able to understand it. When we think about basic reading literacy, we all learn to read and write. Not many of us turn into novelists or journalists. We have basic math literacy. Sometimes I question that when people are trying to compute a tip, but we'll leave it at that. But we don't expect everybody, just because we expect them to be able to add and subtract, to be mathematical geniuses. It's the same thing here. We need a basic level of understanding of what does it mean to be an algorithm. One of my first courses in university when I was studying computer science, the professor said, "Tell me how you would teach a robot how to cross a street." And it was a hysterical exercise because you realize just how dumb a computer is. They say, well, you just start walking across the street until you get to the other side, and the robot falls over because you didn't tell him about the curb. Look both ways before you cross. And he looks both ways, sees a car, and steps out and gets hit because you didn't tell it what to look for. Or that if he does see a car, he needs to retry. And all of these things we take for granted, we have to tell the computer. Computers are stupid. However, they don't seem stupid to a lot of people. Why is it that we should have a right to this knowledge and others don't? We need to think about code literacy as a way of empowering all of the rest of humanity because technology is so pervasive, it impacts everybody's lives. You can't really be a good citizen in a democracy if you don't understand issues like how news feeds are manipulated. That was another one. Oh, of course, it's a completely objective news feed. They've admitted that they've done psychological tests, experiments, research by manipulating the feed. What does objective mean in that context? So we need to demystify technology. People are not going to feel comfortable interacting with technology if they're afraid of it. I've watched people who basically stand back and, oh, did I do something wrong? Is it going to blow up? No, your laptop is not going to blow up just because you've seen the blue screen of death. But this is, for people who don't understand technology, this is a common reaction. They think it's magic. And if you're looking at something that you think is magic, how do you feel any sense of agency? How do you feel like you can take control of the information that you're looking at, the news that you're reading, if you think that there's some magic behind there that's feeding it to you and you have no control over it? We have to start to demystify this. And when you think about it, there are huge percentages of our population that really do think it's magic. The elderly, as people get Parkinsons, their fingers move around. How easy do you think it is for them to use those little tiny keyboards? How embarrassed are they when they're trying to put something in and their hands are shaking? They lose their eyesight and they can't read what's on the screen, those little screens. Are we thinking about how to deal with an aging population, particularly where the average lifespan is just getting longer? These things don't get better for us. And of course, fake news. How do we actually start to recognize this? How do we control it? What should we be thinking about and how we're interacting? How can we as citizens and as humans and as participants in society start to look at some of these questions? Fake news and all this manipulation, this is not coming from something objective. This is coming from algorithms that people like me and people like some of you are creating. We have to figure out how to empower more people to at least understand what it is that we are doing. And it's not really just the older generation either. We need to think about people who haven't been growing up with technology. People who are learning to program in places like Nairobi, Kenya, and Johannesburg, South Africa, who haven't necessarily grown up with this technology. We need people to feel like they can participate in this technology society, at least to the level of understanding what is going on and what is possible. One of the interesting things when you look at some of the, particularly the app culture that has grown up, you've got lots of small organizations and individuals thinking, I can solve problems. And yes, each of us as individuals can solve problems. But the big problems, climate change, environmental impact, pollution remediation, these kinds of problems are going to require larger groups of people. So we need more diverse problem-solving skills applied to some of these problems so we can start to think a bit more creatively, perhaps, on how we're going to solve these. A fascinating book by someone, Thomas Kuhn. He's a historian of science. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he looked at all of the major scientific revolutions. This book is from about the 60s, 1960s, so some of the more recent ones are obviously missing. And what he found, that all of those major insights either came from someone who was very young or very new to the discipline, or perhaps in a related discipline. Because when you're looking at a problem and when you're trained in a particular way, you apply a particular worldview to the problem, and you have a particular set of tools and assumptions that you make about what is possible and what is not. Plate tectonics was not proposed by someone in the geological field, but another scientist in a related field, because the people who were trained as geologists could not accept that this was in fact true. It was too far out of their worldview. We need to broaden the participation of people from other disciplines to allow them to bring their ideas so we can solve some of the critical problems that we have. But we can't do that if they're afraid. So we need to perpetuate understanding rather than fear and alienation. In my family at Christmas time, we have the geek circle, and we have the medical circle, and then we have the teacher circle. And it seems like none of us can really speak each other's language. And this is in my own family. And so my nephew and I talk geek over here. He's a biomedical engineer. And my sister and her daughter-in-law and her other son talk about doctor stuff, because that's what people do. We need to broaden our tent, because our tent is actually taking over the world, and we need to bring more people in. We need to involve people in solving their own problems so that we don't do things that are inappropriate in the context, so that we don't disrupt the social life of a group by trying to do a nice thing and make it easier for them to get water. And a big problem is, by demystifying this, people can start to feel like they can explore. I've watched people literally sitting in terror in front of a computer because they're sure if they hit the wrong key, they're going to break something. I have actually heard people say, you're sure it's not going to blow up, or you're sure it's not going to catch fire. For people who aren't living technology as we are, that's how they feel. They're terrified of it. I got a chance to hear the creator of the Raspberry Pi speak once. He's a professor at a university in the United Kingdom. And he said the reason he invented it was how clueless many of his students were when they came into his university course. And he thought about it, and he talked to them about what their childhood was like. And they didn't have the kind of computers that your parents let you take apart and put back together and figure out how they worked. They had these these expensive video game consoles. And they weren't going to be allowed by their parents to take them apart and figure out how they worked. And so they got to university with no real clear understanding of how technology worked. And so he wanted to create something that was as cheap as possible so that kids could play with it. And if it broke, that was okay, you could buy another one. We need to make people curious about technology. We need to make them curious enough to want to play, to not make it feel like work, to make it feel like fun, so they can start to understand how it works and then what its potential is. Because if you think something's magic, you don't feel like there's going to be any way that you can harness that magic to solve a problem. If you think it's fun, if you think technology is something you play with, and you think, hey, wait a minute, wouldn't this be great if I did this? We can empower hundreds of thousands. Think, the last IDC figure I heard, there are 20 million people who consider themselves computer programmers. 3.2 billion people are online. We have an enormous shortage of talent in our industry. Let's figure out how people can actually be empowered to use this. We want to support people who are going to make code more accessible. And let me remind you, I'm not saying everybody needs to learn how to code. Everybody needs to appreciate code. Just like I'm never going to be Ernest Hemingway, I don't write a whole lot of code anymore, but I can read it, I can understand it, and if I can understand it, then I know what it does. And now I have power over it because I know how I can change it. And that's an important piece of this. So much of our code now is going open source. We can have lots of people reading the code that other people are writing in a vast array of application areas, even in things like medical record systems. Those are in open source. Graphics libraries, all kinds of things. The code that's out there now for people to read is tremendous. We need to help people learn enough to be able to read code, understand it, and feel like they are empowered to participate in this technological revolution. So I'm asking you all to become an agent of code literacy. There are lots of programs out there. We want to think about how can we make it easier for people to understand technology. Some of it is we need to figure out as technologists how to communicate with those who maybe aren't as comfortable. Let's drop all the TLAs that are known as three-letter acronyms. Let's try to communicate more as humans. Let's make this more inclusive so that people can start to participate in these undertakings, because code literacy is getting to be as important as basic literacy. Can you imagine what it's like for the people now who can't read? What it must be like to go through life not being able to read. We're not too far from the point where code is going to be as ubiquitous in many ways as written material is now. And we've got billions of people who can't read code. So I'd like to ask you all to be that agent. Start to demystify. We don't have to impress people with how cool technology is. They know it. They're probably afraid of it. Help them get over that. Help them learn how to play. Tech is fun. More people ought to realize just how fun this is. Thank you very much.